Who taught him that? Mike Curry's voice tore through the library's silence like breaking glass. The east wing of the Curry mansion had always been a cathedral of quiet, polished oak, gold fixtures, and too much space for one grieving father and his silent son. But that silence had just been broken by something else entirely: laughter. Michelle Harris froze mid-dust, her orange gloves still poised above a row of framed family photos. She'd been working here less than a week, long enough to learn what not to touch, and whose sorrow filled the air. But as she passed the library, she heard the sound again, a soft giggle, light and impossible. Ronnie Curry, the billionaire's 5-year-old deaf son, was laughing. No one had ever heard him laugh. Not since his mother's accident. Inside the vast library, Ronnie sat perched on an antique chair, a small card in his hand, smiling as if the world had just whispered a secret. Michelle crouched low, careful not to startle him. She knew that expression, the flicker between confusion and joy. Her mother had worn it when Michelle, as a child, signed her first full sentence. Without thinking, she whispered the same words her mother used to say, "You're safe, sweetheart." Then she traced a single sign across her heart, "Safe." Ronnie blinked, eyes wide. He touched his chest, mimicked the motion, and then, for the first time in 2 years, laughed out loud. "What's going on here?" Mike stood in the doorway, his voice sharp with disbelief. His tailored suit looked out of place amid the warmth of the moment. "Why is my son?" He couldn't even finish. Ronnie turned toward him, still smiling, and mouthed a word. One Mike hadn't heard since Elise died. The billionaire's breath caught. His son had just spoken. And the maid who made it happen, the one he barely noticed a week ago, now held the key to everything he thought he'd lost. But before begin, click subscribe, like, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to the story. Morning light slipped through the small window of the servants' quarters, spilling across the folded linens on Michelle's lap. She sat on the edge of her cot, still in her black uniform, fingers moving mechanically through the motions of folding, but her mind was miles away. Ronnie's laughter echoed in her memory. It had been bright, unfiltered, almost holy. Yet when she'd gone to the kitchen that morning, no one had mentioned it. No congratulations. No wonder. The mansion buzzed with its usual quiet efficiency, silverware polished, marble floors gleaming, as if nothing miraculous had happened in that library. To them, she was still just the maid. Michelle smiled faintly, smoothing the fabric in her hands. "You're safe," she whispered under her breath, the same words she'd mouthed to the boy. She hadn't realized how naturally they'd come until now. They were her mother's words. Her mind drifted back to Detroit, a cramped apartment where laughter had been replaced by silence long before her mother lost her hearing completely. Michelle had been 6 when she learned her first sign, love. Her mother used to press her hand against Michelle's cheek to hear her laughter through vibration. "Listen with your eyes," her mother would sign, smiling. The heart never lies in silence. After her mother's death, the world became loud, too loud. The foster homes, the pitying stares, the jobs that measured worth in obedience. Every place she'd cleaned had its own kind of noise, shouting, gossip, television static. But this mansion was different. Its silence wasn't peaceful, it was grieving. And yesterday, just for a moment, she had heard it breathe. The door creaked open. Mrs. Dalton, the head maid, stood with arms crossed. "Mr. Curry doesn't like staff getting involved. Whatever happened yesterday, best let it go." Michelle set the folded towel aside, her gaze calm. "I wasn't trying to get involved," she said softly. "I was just listening." Mrs. Dalton frowned. "Stay in your lane, Michelle. He pays for silence." Michelle met her eyes, voice steady. "Sometimes," she said, "silence is the only thing that crosses back." The mansion was quiet again. Too quiet. Mike Curry sat alone in his study, the soft hum of the computer casting a faint glow over the polished mahogany desk. On the corner sat a framed photograph, Elise, smiling beneath a summer sky, her arms around a younger Ronnie. The glass of scotch beside it was untouched, as it had been for 3 nights straight. He stared at the picture until the edges blurred. The rain from that night always came back first, the wipers struggling, the phone call unanswered, the flashing lights on the highway. Elise had been driving to pick up Ronnie from preschool because he'd said, "Just one more meeting." He remembered her last text, "Be home soon. Tell him I love him." But she never came home. Since then, Mike had learned how to silence memories, with meetings, with money, with motion. He built a life so full of noise that grief couldn't speak. But when the house went quiet again each night, the silence pressed against him like guilt-made air. He rubbed his temples, closing the laptop. In the hallway, the sound of faint movement drew him toward Ronnie's room. The door was cracked open, spilling a warm stripe of light across the carpet. Inside, Michelle knelt beside Ronnie's bed, her gray uniform softened by the glow of the bedside lamp. Ronnie watched her hands closely as she signed goodnight. He hesitated, then lifted his own small fingers and signed it back, a little shaky, but sure. Mike stood frozen, one hand on the doorframe. It wasn't the boy's movement that struck him, it was the look on his face. Peaceful. Safe. Something he hadn't seen since Elisa's laughter filled these halls. Michelle gently pulled up the blanket, whispered something he couldn't hear, and turned off the light. For a long moment, Mike stayed there in the half-dark, listening to the quiet breathing of his son. It was steady, unbroken, the kind of sound a home makes when it's finally starting to heal. He swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's not him who can't hear," he said. "Maybe it's me." Morning light streamed through the library windows, catching in the dust motes that danced between the shelves. Michelle sat beside a small upright piano she'd found covered in a sheet, coaxing soft chords from keys that hadn't been touched in years. The faint vibration hummed through the air, barely audible, but enough for Ronnie to feel. "Here," she said gently, guiding his hands to the surface of the piano. "Feel that?" Ronnie's face lit up. He pressed one key, then another, his small palms resting flat as if catching invisible ripples. Each note pulsed beneath his fingertips, and his laughter, bright and unrestrained, filled the room like music without sound. From the doorway, Mike froze. He hadn't planned to stop, but something in that laughter, the same laugh he'd once heard echoing from Elisa's arms, rooted him to the spot. Michelle didn't notice him at first. She signed slowly, her gestures graceful, deliberate. "Happy." Ronnie mirrored her hands, then, with quiet determination, formed the word on his lips. "Happy." It was barely more than a breath, but it carried through the stillness like a song. Mike's chest tightened. He'd spent years chasing solutions with doctors and devices, but this simple exchange between maid and child, was what he'd been searching for all along. Love without instruction. Understanding without demand. Michelle looked up, startled to see him there. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. But Mike only shook his head, eyes bright with something close to wonder. "Don't be." His voice was low, unsteady. "Please, don't stop." For a moment, all three of them existed in that fragile space, sunlight, soundless joy, and the quiet rhythm of hope returning. Then a faint click shattered it. Across the room, the housekeeper stood half-hidden near the doorway, her phone tilted just so. She caught the image, the billionaire, the maid, and the laughing boy, before slipping away unnoticed. Minutes later, that photo would hit the gossip feeds with a headline bold enough to burn: "The billionaire's maid replaces the therapist." By morning, the mansion's silence had been replaced by whispers. They drifted through the corridors like smoke, the kind that clings to curtains and never really leaves. The tabloids had struck first, billionaire's unusual attachment to his maid. Mike stared at the headline glowing from his phone, a photo of himself frozen mid-step in the library doorway, eyes soft, mouth half open. Beside him, Michelle knelt by Ronnie, the boy's laughter caught in perfect focus. The caption beneath it twisted everything: "The billionaire replaces therapists with his maid." By noon, the boardroom was packed. His investors didn't care about the truth, only optics. "This story's spreading like wildfire," one said. "You need distance, immediately." "She's staff, Mike," another added. "You can't afford this kind of sentiment right now." He said nothing for a long time, fingers pressed against his temples. He could still hear Ronnie's voice, that fragile, breathless, happy. And yet, he finally nodded. "I'll handle it." When Michelle entered his office later that day, her uniform still faintly dusted with flour from Ronnie's baking lesson, she already knew. "Please," she said quietly, "he's only just started to open up. You can't take that from him now." Mike looked up, the weight of the world behind his eyes. "This isn't about him, Michelle. It's about everyone else." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "Then you're listening to the wrong people." 2 hours later, black sedans pulled up the long drive. The brass badge on one man's jacket read Child Protective Services. The officers moved through the mansion, not unkindly but without compassion, snapping photos of Ronnie's toys, his drawings, his piano. Michelle stood frozen, her hands clasped, as if moving would make it worse. In the doorway, Ronnie watched, confusion shadowing his face. One officer knelt to speak to him, but the boy turned away, shaking his head. As they led Michelle toward the exit, he bolted forward, grabbing her sleeve with trembling fingers. Tears streaked down his cheeks as he signed, "Don't go." Her throat tightened. "I'll come back, sweetheart." The heavy doors closed behind her, and the house fell silent again. The storm rolled in without warning, rain hammering the windows in furious rhythm. Lightning split the sky, flashing against the darkened streets as Michelle clutched the small stuffed rabbit to her chest. She shouldn't have been there, she'd been dismissed, her key returned, her place in the mansion erased. But the thought of Ronnie crying without it had torn through her resolve. She slipped through the servants' entrance, heart pounding in sync with the thunder. The halls were dim, the kind of dark that remembered her footsteps. Every creak of the floor felt like betrayal. She paused outside the library door when a faint sound reached her, soft, broken gasps. Inside, Ronnie was huddled beneath the piano bench, knees drawn tight to his chest, eyes wide with fear. Each flash of lightning sent him flinching, every rumble of thunder pulling another whimper from his throat. Michelle's heart twisted. She crossed the room quietly, kneeling a few feet away so he could see her face. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It's okay. I'm right here." He didn't move, but his gaze flickered toward the rabbit in her hands. She placed it gently on the floor between them and signed safe. Then, just as she had when she was a little girl comforting her own mother during panic attacks, she whispered words he couldn't hear but could feel. "You are not broken," she mouthed. "You are brave." Her voice trembled through the space like a prayer. Ronnie's lips quivered. His chest rose sharply. And then, through the trembling, came a fragile sound, small, rough, but real. "Brave." The world seemed to stop. Michelle froze, eyes filling with tears as he repeated it, louder this time, clutching the rabbit against his heart. "Brave." Unseen in the doorway, Mike stood motionless, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The crash made Ronnie jump, then look up. Mike's mouth opened, but no words came. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of awe, of disbelief, of everything he thought he'd lost. For the first time in years, the house breathed again. By sunrise, the world had already chosen its side. Every news channel blazed the same story: Michelle's face, caught mid-step in the rain, framed beneath bold headlines, disgraced maid caught in billionaire scandal. Photos of her holding Ronnie's hand were twisted into something they were not. Mike stared at the headlines from his desk, jaw set, rage simmering beneath grief. Overnight, the woman who had given his son a voice had been turned into a villain. He picked up his phone and made a single call. "Get the press ready," he told his assistant. "I'm setting the record straight." That afternoon, cameras lined the steps of the Curry Foundation building. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs bursting like gunfire. When Mike stepped up to the podium, he didn't read from the notes in front of him. He didn't need to. "This woman," he said, voice carrying through the wind, "gave my son his voice. And anyone who believes she's capable of harm doesn't know what healing looks like." The clip spread faster than the scandal itself. Within hours, an internal investigation revealed the truth. Richard Lane, Mike's longtime corporate rival, had fabricated the allegations to discredit him. The fabricated report, the leaked photos, even the anonymous call to child services, all traced back to Lane's company. But clearing Michelle's name wasn't enough. Justice had to be seen. 2 weeks later, in a crowded courtroom, Michelle took the stand. The room buzzed with murmurs, but her gaze stayed steady. When asked to explain her actions, she spoke softly, clearly. "He wasn't mute," she said, eyes glistening. "He was unheard." The words landed like truth-breaking glass. And then, a sound, small, trembling, yet unmistakable. Ronnie stood from his seat beside the attorney, signing with both hands, safe, with her. The audience stilled, every breath held. Then came his voice, fragile, trembling, but certain. "Don't take Mama, Shell." The courtroom froze. Judges, reporters, even the opposing counsel went silent. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the echo of that small, brave voice. Then, slowly, the silence shattered into applause. Michelle turned toward Mike, unsure if this was triumph or just the beginning of something even greater. Days after the trial, the noise that once condemned Michelle turned into a chorus of praise. The same headlines that had smeared her name now carried it with reverence: "The maid who taught the billionaire to listen." Her photo, the quiet woman with kind eyes and steady hands, was everywhere. Talk shows called her an angel. Bloggers called her a miracle. But Michelle didn't read any of it. She spent her mornings where she always wanted to be, beside Ronnie. The boy who once lived in silence now filled the mansion with motion. His hands danced as he signed new words, his laughter echoing down the marble halls that had forgotten how to hold joy. Sometimes, he spoke too, testing sound, shape, courage, each word a small victory. Mike withdrew from the limelight. The world demanded interviews and press appearances, but he refused them all. Instead, he focused on something Elise had always dreamed of: a foundation for children with hearing impairments. He named it the Elise Curry Foundation for Communication and Care. When he asked Michelle to lead it, she tried to decline. "I'm not a leader," she'd said softly. "I'm just someone who listens." He smiled, a quiet, genuine curve of the lips that softened years of grief. "That's exactly why it should be you." And so, the woman who had once scrubbed the floors of his mansion began building programs that would teach parents and children to communicate through empathy, not just sound. She spoke before small groups, signed before larger ones, and always ended the same way: every voice matters, even the quiet ones. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Michelle sat in the library helping Ronnie with his reading. Mike stood nearby, watching them, a small smile tugging at his mouth. He hesitated, then slowly lifted his hands, forming shaky shapes in the air. "Thank you." Michelle looked up, eyes widening. His signing was clumsy but heartfelt. She reached out, corrected the motion gently, and smiled. "You're learning," she whispered. He nodded once. "From the best," he said. And for the first time, gratitude filled the silence where sorrow used to live. Months passed, and the mansion that once echoed with silence now hummed softly with life. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall library windows, the same ones that had witnessed laughter, tears, and miracles. On the piano, tiny fingerprints dotted the polished wood, Ronnie's reminders that even quiet hearts could make music. Michelle sat beside him, guiding his small hands as he pressed down the keys. The sound was faint, imperfect, but enough to make him giggle. A small speaker on the table pulsed gently, letting him feel the rhythm in his fingertips. "Good," she said, smiling. "That's your sound. You can feel it, can't you?" Ronnie nodded, pressing his palms to the piano again. His lips moved, carefully shaping the word. "Happy." The room seemed to exhale. From the doorway, Mike watched, not as a businessman, not as a man burdened by loss, but as a father. The sight of them together, his son radiant, Michelle calm and steady, felt like sunlight finding the last corners of his grief. He stepped inside quietly. Ronnie turned, his face lighting up. "Daddy." Mike crouched as the boy ran into his arms. He lifted him easily, laughing as Ronnie clung to his neck. Then, as if remembering something important, Ronnie leaned back, his little fingers tightening on Mike's collar. His voice came out soft, breathy, but clear. "Love you, Daddy." The words were small, but they struck like thunder. Mike's arms tightened around him, tears spilling down without restraint. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then, remembering Michelle's lessons, he signed slowly, "Love you too." Ronnie smiled, mimicking the sign back, his little hands shaking with joy. Across the room, Michelle watched them through a blur of tears, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She didn't move, didn't need to. Some moments were too sacred for words. The light outside deepened into gold, filling the library with warmth. Mike sat with Ronnie on his lap, Michelle beside them, the three of them framed by the soft hum of the world beyond the glass. For the first time, there was no silence to break, only the sound of love. Thank you for watching till the end. Click subscribe and let me know the lessons you learned in the comment below, and turn on the notification bell because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it.